Hey everyone, welcome to a new First Impressions. I'm Rob Beeler, founder and CEO of Beeler.Tech. And this is one of my favorite things to do, which is our First Impressions series, where I guess I call it like an ad tech unboxing video, where we get to kind of dive in and see some of the tech and talk about the tech. And this particular topic, and I love the title of this, Hidden Audiences. I kind of feel like my audiences are learning to hide more and more every day with all the various regulations and technology and so forth. And we're going to dive into that. And along the way, we're going to talk through and learn some concepts that I think are going to be important for us in the future. And to help me with that, we've got a couple of people who are joining me from the Permutive team. So Artie is our product marketing manager, and David is a product manager both at Permutive. So thanks for joining us. And I know you have some content to share with us, kind of talk us through some concepts here. And so Artie, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Rob. Thanks for having us. So the prevailing narrative in the ad tech ecosystem prioritizes the changing conditions around privacy, but not the symptoms. So today we see regulators and platforms as simply providing consumers with the choice of whether their data can or can't be used by digital advertising. And when given that choice, consumers are starting to say no to digital advertising using their data. Ultimately, this means consumers are putting up barriers between their data and advertising.
So let me ask on that front. So what kind of proof are you seeing? Like how is that manifesting itself?
Sure. So at Permutive, we work with publishers to run addressability tests, and between Safari and Firefox blocking cookies and 40% of users on average opting out of advertising within Chrome, the average percentage of users that are actually targetable with data in the open web and for those using legacy platforms is around 30%. And that ultimately means that 7 out of 10 consumers are hidden from current targeting tactics. And in Europe, that is less. And that's a result of the enforcement of regulation where businesses must make it just as easy for consumers to reject to data collection and ad tracking as it is to accept. And we're seeing up to 55% of consumers opt out, leaving publishers unable to address and monetize this audience. So consumers are proactively choosing to protect their data. So for example, Google recently updated their consent banners, and they're clearly giving consumers the choice to reject or to advertising companies handling their data. So up to 50% of users are choosing to do so. And we've all heard about ATT, and we're seeing 80% of users opting out of app tracking. And then we started to hear everyone in market talking about hashed email addresses as a solution to this. And Apple has provided an opt-out via Hide My Email, making unified IDs, ATS, and other workarounds a lot of work for little return.
I'm seeing that as well.
So we can talk about Google's reject all being a GDPR issue, but privacy legislation in the US is well on its way to becoming passed. So by a 53-2 vote, the House Committee on Energy and Commerce advanced the American Data Privacy and Protection Act to the House of Representatives. And the intent is to rein in abuses of big tech companies and restrict their consumer data collection and the use and transfer of their consumer data. National legislation is coming with changes made to CPRA and the potential implementation of the Surveillance Advertising Act.
Yeah, I think it's an important point that you're making, that some of this is about user privacy, right? And ensuring that the spirit, right, of that makes a lot of sense. And at the same time, a lot of this regulation is really going after, the big tech companies in a way that's, again, trying to penalize them for building the monopolies that they have and trying to rein them in, right? And so I think we have to make sure we keep an eye on whether we're solving, or some of the stuff is solving for privacy or solving for them. But as people are, publishers are kind of trying to navigate that, what are some of the things that they should really be kind of aware of at this point today?
Yeah, absolutely. So the challenges that advertising is facing today is really less about third-party cookie deprecation and more about responsibly making invisible audiences visible and reaching consumers. And this is where publishers come in. So these changes in regulation and consumer choice really have leveled the playing field for big tech and publishers. They now have the same impact. Google have reject all, and publishers might have to implement that too. And so really it's creating an opportunity for publishers to act now and not wait for Google. And Permutive is able to support with that. And we believe that publishers are really uniquely positioned to address the entirety of their opted out audiences. And there's kind of three fundamental reasons for that. One, publishers have a direct one-to-one relationship with their users. They have an opportunity to rebuild consumer trust by capturing consent responsibly and working with enablers of data rather than intermediaries of data. And whilst consent may not be given, contextual signals still exist. Users still engage with publisher content, and really contextual signals become a really useful way to understand relevancy. And contextual signals, importantly, don't identify users in any way. So there's no cookie IDs or user IDs that are used. And really importantly, and finally, publishers are the proud owners of two very powerful signals. One, they have first-party data, and two, they're the creators of content. And so when publishers are able to bring together audience and contextual signals, they can build a really powerful and competitive offering. And with Permutive, publishers are then able to provide another pathway for their advertisers to reach a desired audience. And so through our contextual and affinity cohorts, publishers are able to maximize addressability and increase their opportunities to grow revenue. And I'll pass on to David, who will be able to talk about these solutions in more detail.
Thanks, Arti. So as Arti mentioned, Permutive has two solutions for reaching opted out users. This is firstly contextual cohorts and secondly affinity cohorts. For contextual cohorts, what those are doing is they help publishers to achieve maximum addressability by leveraging publisher metadata, page signals, automated classification, all of the typical contextual signals that you're probably familiar with. Those signals are used to build and manage complex targeting rules and to respectfully reach opted out users. Affinity cohorts, on the other hand side, they're really like the next generation of contextual targeting, I would say. They are about maximizing addressability by reaching opted out audiences, but doing this using unique audience data. And for the rest of the session, I really want to focus on those affinity cohorts and go into more detail on what they actually are. Gotcha.
So I want to spend a moment. Can we go back for a second? So what I'm seeing, contextual cohorts make sense to me. I've got that forward, and so you're going to spend some time on affinity cohorts. One of the things that you kind of use kind of the phrasing about like respectfully reaching opted out users, right? And I think there's an aspect that perhaps you kind of feel as someone is opted out, they're kind of lost to us. And Arti, I love your phrasing of like, invisible audiences and trying to make them visible. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by kind of respectfully reaching these opted out users?
Yeah, I use the term respectfully because I think it's all about respecting user choice, right? The last few years, we've spoken a lot about respecting the user choice of not being tracked cross-domain, and that has been really enabled by browsers blocking the third-party cookie. Now, in this context, we're speaking about another user choice that needs to be respected, and it's the user choice of not any of their data being stored or processed at all. So the reject all. So respectfully, because at the end of the day, it's all about respecting the user's choice, whether that is enabled by browser changes or whether that is enabled by new legislation.
Gotcha.
I would add one additional point in that we recently had a webinar where we involved the ICO, who are a UK regulator. And one key point they made there was when a user opts out of data collection, as David said, and data processing, they're not opting out of advertising. They're making a choice for their data not to be collected, but it doesn't mean they can't be advertised to. And that's a thing that's important to be remembered there. So there's contextual solutions that are still viable when a user rejects all.
Key point. Great.
Great. So as I said, I'd really like to deep dive into affinity cohorts. So the idea with affinity cohorts is that publishers can leverage the insights from their first-party consented audiences and understand their affinity to specific cohorts. This really allows them to understand whether a given audience is more or less likely to engage with a given piece of content, and therefore make targeting decisions for opted out audiences. So affinity cohorts really enable publishers to combine their unique audience data and their content to safely reach and monetize all users, regardless of them having opted in or having opted out. What's really important here is that for affinity cohorts, no cookie IDs or really no user IDs at all are stored or processed. Instead, affinity cohorts really calculate the affinity of an audience for a given URL. And that means publishers are therefore targeting pages rather than users, and it helps them to expand the reach when delivering relevant ads. Today, when we think about contextual targeting, really what we think about is a user visits a website and we understand the various signals that are available, the metadata of the page, the classification of the page. In the example that we have on the screen here, we would know that this is a positive skincare review. However, with affinity cohorts now, we can also understand audience affinity to that content. So really enriching the signals that are available for that content with the aggregated insights from consented users. We can understand whether a given audience is more or less likely to engage with this piece of content. So affinity cohorts really intelligently calculate the affinity score across all of the publisher URLs for a chosen audience cohort. And the data that's being used to calculate this is data from consented opted-in users. And the aggregated understanding is then used to reach opted-out users on the publisher site, targeting relevant ads based on that URL.
Yeah, so talk through that a little bit more. Again, this is fascinating, right? Because again, it's not the same as say a lookalike or whatever, but it's this kind of scoring based on the URL, passing that through, right? And then again, I could see where you're basically again scoring the pages, not the user. So I make sure like people get that concept, because I think that again puts the regulation piece aside, right?
Mm-hmm.
Again, it's that particular part. I think in my mind, what I'm trying to think as a publisher is how I start to think through my content and how much Permutive is going to do to what I have to do, and start kind of from that strategy. So whether you've got other examples or can kind of dive in, I'd love to understand this a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I like your comparison to lookalike models. I think there is a parallel here. It is making a prediction. The real difference here is that when we think about lookalike models, it is an audience-based approach. So you are evaluating a model for a user, which means you need to have the right consent in place to store data and process data for that user. Whereas with affinity cohorts, it's more of a page attribute that is created, and that's being used to make decisions. So again, if we look at the example that we have on the slide here, we can see from like a pure contextual perspective, it's a skincare review. But by overlaying aggregated insights from consented users, we can also see that users that are in the luxury fashion and the luxury traveler audience are over-indexing for this review. And that means that users in those cohorts, in those audiences, are more likely to engage with this particular piece of content compared to the site average. And that's now information that is tied to this page that luxury fashion and luxury travel users over-index here. And it's information that publishers can use to make targeting decision purely based on the information available for the page.
And the publisher controls that, right? So what I mean by control, right, is I get to determine what these segments are and how I put them out to market, right? So in other words, again, it isn't, this is one of the things that concerns me most about the future of things is having other people telling me as a publisher what my site is and what it's worth. And what I'm hearing is based on, again, I've got opted in users. So I'm feeding some of this back to you, right? So I make sure I've got this right? Opted in users give me a feel based on what I know about them and other behaviors and so forth that like, okay, this is the type of person that's coming to this particular page that allows me to tie to this page value so that when there's other impressions, regardless of the user, if I don't know something, I have some sense of what advertising is going to work, what they're going to react to and so forth. And I can better match those particular pieces. And as I understand that, then I'm able to then, for example, create a luxury travel enthusiast because they index well against this particular content, and it has nothing to do with the user, has to do with all about this page. I think I got it, David. I think I'm getting this.
Spot on. Love your summary. And I think the point that you made about the publisher value is really important here as well. What I'm really excited about here is that it really bridges the gap between traditional contextual and the audience offering that a publisher has. So the new insights, those affinity scores, they are really powered by the unique data that a publisher has. So it is really a data offering that only the publisher can generate. And it means they have a really unique way of reaching opted out users that only they can take to market, because only they have this understanding, those aggregated insights from their consented users that they can overlay and then target accordingly.
Great.
Okay, so if we try to visualize this a bit further, those affinity scores, you can really envision this as a massive matrix of audience cohorts and URLs. So for each combination of a publisher's audience cohort and each URL, we are calculating those affinity scores. And as you can imagine, they're typically not 6 or 7 cohorts, there are hundreds of thousands of audience cohorts, and there are tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of URLs. So there's a lot of processing happening here. And we actually do this processing really frequently. We update all of those scores every 2 hours or so, which means that even if a publisher has a very fast moving content cycle, we're still delivering, or they're still delivering, the most relevant ads to their audiences without compromising on scale. So it's all about finding the patterns within this matrix of audience data versus URLs. And you mentioned lookalike models earlier, that there are some similarities in the approach, right? So similar to lookalike modeling, where typically you choose between scale and similarity. In this model here, you choose between affinity and reach. So you can go for higher affinity. You can say, I want to only target on pages where, in this case, my pet lovers cohort has an affinity of at least 5x with relatively low scale, or you could go down the affinity curve and achieve more scale. Just really want to reiterate what I said earlier, that in contrast to lookalike models, where we train models across audiences, those are predictions against URLs, not specific users. And again, with the example that we have on the page here, like we would have affinity scores for the pet lover audience for 5 of the URLs. And if you want to target pages where pet lovers have an affinity of at least 2x, meaning that they show at least 2 times the engagement as the site average, we would automatically know that this is page 1 and 5 in this example here.
That addresses a big issue I think publishers have around scale, right? And I think that there's an aspect again of like being able to sit there and try to solve and also look at performance across these things. I think there's a lot here that it, allows us, again, just straight up without any kind of creating these kind of segments gets really specific and gets really difficult to do. Scale becomes really important, but I feel like what you've done is help create kind of a narrative around that to where you could sit there and say, if your goal is to reach more people, I can do that, lower index, right, against that. So in other words, some of this will be, one of the things that'll be really interesting is to see how talking to the buy side is around this. But you're, as a publisher, again, you're controlling the narrative of going, oh, you want people that are even more heavily indexed on this? smaller audience, higher CPM, let's build something along those lines. Oh, you're trying to reach just this overall market, right? And I think that those are things that, like, the buy side needs to hear and they need to think about, and they got to think about experimenting with these things, right? They need to sit there and understand that, like, pet lovers, someone who is, a certain level of that, maybe compared to another pet lover, like, you're splitting hairs, where again, let's see what might work at a larger scale and then decide how to adjust from there. And again, you learn things in this process, all in the tool, which I think is amazing.
Absolutely. And I think learning is super important, right? It's a very new approach towards consentless contextual targeting. It is this audience insights driven approach. So you mentioned, like, how's the buy side reacting to it? It is, certainly a different way of approaching it, and we certainly, like, are really keen on those learnings. Okay, so summarizing, affinity cohorts are really about maximizing addressability by leveraging learnings from consented users to target opted out users. So it's about bringing scale and precision to advertisers, helping them to find their target audiences wherever they are in their journey and whether they're opted in or opted out. And it's about publishers not having to compromise on scale and relevancy. Those affinity scores are recalculated every 2 hours. They are powered by audience data that is real time with on-device processing. So it means always the most up-to-date information is available when calculating the affinity score. And what I think is really exciting about affinity-based targeting is that it is bridging this gap between contextual and audience-based targeting. It is about leveraging the learnings that are really from the unique audiences that a publisher has, the unique audience insights from consented users, to then reach the opted out user in a privacy safe way.
Great. So if someone were to want to learn more, so I have some questions and some thoughts on what I just said or so forth, but I want to make sure that if anyone is interested in learning more, there it is. There's the email address, right? So they can reach out to learn more. I think I'm going to feed back some thoughts on what I heard in my takeaways on this, and also have some questions for you myself. There's an aspect to this that's so key, is this, again, you hit on that word respectfully. And I think there's just this aspect of, like, our relationship with our audiences is, like, the most important thing that we have, right? Regardless regulation or whatever, we have to be able to sit there and work out a value exchange with our people and let them know we're going to be supported by advertising, right? And, Artie, I think you kind of made that point that, like, this is different than ad blocking, right? There are people who are going to, if they are still seeing ads, they may still opt out, right, for tracking. Those are two different lines. And I think we have to respect that. And I think that's one of the things that concerns me about a lot of the solutions that are out there, is they're really coming up trying to, like, make bets that some regulation isn't going to play out the particular way. And I think at the end of the day, it's about the spirit of things, and it's about the big tech companies. So I think that makes sense. And taking that control as a publisher of your narrative is so important. And I think, again, what you're seeing is you'll have those people that are opted in. They're informing the pages. Again, I like this idea of not going right to a direct lookalike, but, like, tying that to the page, I think just is going to allow for a lot more flexibility. One of the questions I have for you, David, is, you had that one graphic where you had, like, the URLs, and you have the various audience segments that are associated to that. Are those all, say, standard Permutive ones? Are they IAB ones? Are they publisher centric? How do some of those segments get defined, so I know what things what flexibility I have to work with?
So those are the audiences that the publisher defines. And I think that's really important, because we really want to enable publishers to create a very differentiated and unique data offering that they can take to market. that they can use to win briefs, win rebookings, because they have insights and audiences and understanding that nobody else has, because it's their audience. They understand their audience best. And when we speak about affinity cohorts, it's taking those insights from those unique audiences that are publisher specific and turning them into those page signals that can be targeted for any user.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I've had this comment about I feel like everyone should be adopting like the IAB Tech Lab taxonomy so that overall we have scale around publisher first party data. But so I run golf.com. I don't want anyone saying that they have golf content as good as I have content, right? So I think your point is really something everyone has to remember is you do want to go out to market with something that is differentiated and unique. And at the same time, we have to start talking about the same language. So I like this affinity cohort thing, I think is exciting. And so I think the other piece that you just tied on is that it's time now for publishers to start to really work on this, right? All of this is here for people to learn. That learning process can begin. You can start to learn about what your pages will tell you, right? And then start to build out those data products to go out to market with and so forth. Great.
Just
Please.
sorry, Rob, that like as I mentioned earlier, this is like a great inflection point whereby the level playing field between the Googles and Metas of the world and publishers is the level playing field is now on the same page. And so publishers really have an opportunity to take this moment and maximize their data, maximize their addressability in respectful and privacy safe ways. And that helps them as well to move away from the open market where addressability is reduced into a direct world where both publishers and advertisers benefit.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic way to end. I think that's a certain point. This is definitely an inflection point. Thank you, Artie, and thank you, David, for walking us through that. I feel like I understand something I did not know before, so I appreciate that. And at the same time, I really kind of feel like this is something of a moment, to your point, for publishers to start to act, start to explore what they have with their first party offering, and starting to strengthen it. It's time. It's time. It's you're on the clock. So thank you so much for this. And again, if anyone has any further questions, you can email hello@permutive.com. So thanks everyone for joining First Impressions.